Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and welcome to this very special presentation of producer Alexander Korda's 1940 version of The Thief of Baghdad. It is a pleasure to be sitting here with producer, audio commentator, and Alexander Korda superfan, Mr. Dan Marino. How are you doing today, Dan?
I'm doing very good, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk up, Alexander Corda. I always feel like he doesn't quite get always the love he deserves in the modern times. So this is a beautiful example to highlight that.
Oh, absolutely. And if we look back at him historically, he was such a major driving force within the British film industry. Even though he was born in Hungary, he was an emigre to the United Kingdom.
That is absolutely correct. And in fact, so much so that he was frequently, even in his time, referred to as the British David O. Selznick when they sort of came up at around the same time. And that's absolutely correct. And I think what you see at that time, or leading up to this time, this predates it obviously somewhat, but when it comes to giving it historical context, Europe of the time was getting into a place after the First World War where, as we approach sound coming in, but, with the silence, what Alexander Korda noticed, and this was also something Irving Thalberg noticed, David O. Selznick noticed, many of what would become the moguls that we think of in Hollywood, was the idea of a film going beyond the immediate market of wherever they were, of being an international picture, something that everyone could connect with. And what they all sort of had the idea to do was tap into what was popular source material at the time. And this was, Irving Thalberg is generally credited with sort of creating the prestige film, or be the one creating what would be the sort of, not something that was designed to just be pure entertainment, but was aspiring to our sort of grandiose ideas and the epic storytelling that reflected the human condition in the way that the great novels used to. And while Irving Thalberg is credited for that, Alexander Korda, of all of them, is probably arguably the most sophisticated of them, and the best of his films show the most sophistication at that level. And that is because, as you said, I think he grew up in Europe in a pre-World War I context in Hungary, in Budapest, which is now a vanished world after the two world wars, though we have a lot of remnants of it, thankfully, in the cinematic world, is one that was steeped in high culture of the time. The theater, music, all of that was given a sort of precedence that it wasn't given in American society at the time, and he came from that. That was his background. It was the world that him and his brothers, who were a big part of his films, grew up in. And that's what partly made it so easy for him to navigate. You say he began in Budapest. He did. He then was very easily able to migrate to Vienna, then Berlin, and then Hollywood briefly, and then back to France. And then this was the film that brought him back to America with the outbreak of World War II. And in all of those markets, had huge success with his films that were silent. And he's pretty unique in that way. There's really no one who was a figure of that time that was able to sort of be the sort of international kind of, producerial figure that he was.
Oh yeah. So as significant as we're hyping him up to be, which I don't think you can overstate enough, to some of our people in the audience who may not be familiar with his work, what do you think are Alexander Korda's most important films?
Well, there's quite a few. Like I said, when you get into what we consider to be the prestige film, he was one of the pioneers and kind of innovators of that. And he sort of got the idea to one of his big sort of hits in the English speaking world that sort of really put him on the map in the mid 30s was a sort of series of films that were biopics about very famous figures, many of them starring who was probably the greatest actor of the period, Charles Laughton. Although there's many stars perhaps bigger than him, he really was one of the phenomenal actors of the period, on par with any of the greatest today. And The Private Life of Henry VIII being one of the first big ones. And his view was, if you do a biopic and you show, for the time, warts and all, kind of, and it's almost sort of the gossipy side of the tawdry side of these upper class figures, that would be immensely attractive to audiences of the day. And he was very correct at that point. So all of those series, the Rembrandt series, and then from his own characterization, he aspired to do types of films that were big budget, lavish, that combined the what he loved about the theater, playwriting, music, acting, and grand material, those grandiose emotions, of which I think probably the three best examples are what came in the late 30s, early 40s, which were The Four Feathers, directed by his brother Zoltan Korda and made within his stable as well. This film, The Thief of Baghdad, and then also That Hamilton Woman, which is a very underseen film, but a great, tremendous spectacle with Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. And subsequent to that, he went on to do, what is maybe one of my favorite films of all time, The Third Man, with none other than David O. Selznick.
Right.
Shortly after that, they collaborated with, or just a few to name many. He ended his career with Laurence Olivier's Richard III, which is, arguably one of the best Laurence Olivier Shakespeare adaptations and one of his best performances.
So, what was Corda's interest? Because, in my opinion, to me, The Thief of Baghdad is one of the quintessential fantasy films. It's the one of the greatest adventure films ever made. The
Of all
special
time.
effects of all time, and the special effects are so revolutionary. And so, we've been doing this series of adaptations of The Thousand and One Nights, the ancient collection of Middle Eastern folk tales. What about this collection of stories? And of course, we have to bring up the 1924 version starring Douglas Fairbanks. What about this source material spoke to Corda?
Well, I think what I think spoke to him is what really spoke to, frankly, what you could argue it was generational. Because of the high colonial period, which, again, we view much of this through a very different lens nowadays, and rightly so. So there was a fervor with the publication of the original English translation of A Thousand and One Nights, which I think was in the late 1800s, or very close to the turn of the century, or around there.
Yeah, I think it was like the Sir Richard Burton translation.
Something like that. And
Yeah,
I could be wrong on this, but it was around, I want to say, like the 1880s or 1890s.
right, right.
This caused a huge fervor because the world was open. It's hard to understand through the lens we live today what that world looked like. You had civilization largely that was known to the literate world, confined to Europe, and much of Africa, much of India, much of Asia was a sort of dark mystery.
Yeah.
And this sort of perfectly embodied what was the adventurous colonial impulse of the time, the desire to map out and explore what seemed like these wild new frontiers, in the same way that the American West is mythologized in America. You know what I mean? And so this is, by this point in time, a very late entry in that fervor. That's absolutely true. But things within that world have been exhilarating and inspiring imagination in Europe for quite some time, because I think it was the perfect embodiment of the colonial and expedition fervor that was going on at the time, because these represented completely mysterious cultures, mysterious worlds that were entirely foreign to everything that was known about Europe at the time. You know what I mean? Yeah. Whether a good thing or a bad thing that they were attracted to it in that way, and however they shaped it while they were there, I think that was probably the appeal of the material. There's an inherent adventure quality to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, what do you think? Out of all the Arabian Nights films, to me, this one by far is the best. It is the quintessential adaptation, or at least film inspired by the Nights. Why do you think this film holds up so many years later?
Well, I think what Alexander Korda understood, and this was the thing that was, I think, best embodied by those three films I mentioned, and was kind of his supreme vision of what cinema could be, of which there are only a few examples, was, as I said, the discovery of the idea of cinema being an international global medium and a way into that. And I think what he saw in the Douglas Fairbanks Thief of Baghdad was capitalizing on that interest there. It was something that literally everybody in the world could find their way into the adventure of that. And not only that, you could take advantage of all of the burgeoning technological discoveries that were coming out at that time, and of which Thief of Baghdad was on the cutting edge of. I mean, there's things in there that they were trying to do that, were not really possible. And in fact, you could argue by today's standards, they only achieved them in a sort of haphazard fashion, but they were taking such bold swings with things like matte painting and all of that, which, no one had really done it to that extent at that time. And with Technicolor and all of the above, he saw it, I think, as a perfect vehicle for the international prestige film. And as you said, the perfect adventure film. And that sort of, if people haven't seen The Four Feathers or That Hamilton Woman or other films like that, there is a sense of adventure there, which frankly, he's one of the few filmmakers, I think, and we can call him a filmmaker because he was a director as well. And I think this film famously had quite a few directors. And I think the fact that Alexander Corda was a film director is an excellent reason why there is a through line, or there remains a through line in the film. But there's few producers and films, and all of those films I just mentioned had an equally big impact on the big filmmakers we consider in the film school generation, and in particular this film. You're going to be hard pressed to find a film that had as big of an impact on Scorsese, Coppola, Brian De Palma, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas, all of whom were equally influenced by this picture. So it's hard to find someone that really crosses. I think he kind of achieved his goal with these pictures, even if he wasn't able to quite match it post this time. He certainly has a few shining examples of that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it certainly is a heavily influential film. You can see its DNA in movies like Star Wars, the films of Ray Harryhausen, like the Sinbad trilogy, and of course Disney's Aladdin. I don't think we can mention this film without mentioning Disney's Aladdin.
I think you're completely correct, as you point out, and it's interesting to note that the Ray Harryhausen films, which were greatly, this inspired quite a bit. It's wild to think of it in context that I think those films came out, I think, over 15 years removed from the fact. And what's wild about this film is that you're seeing something removed that far from context. And it's a bit of a non sequitur, but I feel it's really worth mentioning as well. One of the things I love about this film, and all films really from the 30s, if people don't, revisit them enough, is, we think of escapism as kind of something that is I won't say a dirty word, but it has a bit of a negative connotation in more serious film circles and serious art circles nowadays. But, you look at a lot of films pre-World War II, and there is a sincerity and a genuine belief in the fantasy, a collective belief in it, where the audiences almost half believed they were watching these things as sort of waking dreams in front of them. And post-World War II, you see the introduction, I think, this is not to say there aren't examples of high fantasy, high escapism, but you've suddenly introduced postmodernism, irony. There is the darkness of the world setting in of post-World War II, which was, had a calamitous psychological effect on all those affected by it in America and, of course, in Europe. You know what I mean? And while, again, you see many examples of adventure and all of that, it doesn't quite have, what's beautiful about a film like this is there is no irony. It's a fantasy where it's done with total sincerity, and you half believe, the audiences of the time half believed what they were watching was sort of possible on some level. You know what I mean? In a way that you don't get come the 50s and 60s and even Ray Harryhausen films.
Oh yeah, because the film is so beautifully executed. Earlier, you mentioned its influence on Francis Ford Coppola. In addition to Disney's Aladdin, if you watch Bram Stoker's Dracula, there are moments that are restaged from Thief of Baghdad. Why was that?
Well, all over it. Well, what I can tell you is, investigating and researching the impact it had on all of those filmmakers, I can point to all, cite all of them. And while you would think there's no Spielberg or Lucas without this person, the person undoubtedly who was the biggest fan of this movie, I think, was Francis Ford Coppola. He is an absolute fanatic for it. He has seen it too many times to count, frequently says he quotes the film to his family often, has screened it for his family often. He does not carry around, for example, any memorabilia from films generally other than his own, but he has a signed photo of Conrad Veidt. And, I think, interestingly, there might be a reason for that. And this is something that's very fortunate for your audience as well today. And I'm jealous I'm not in the crowd to see it myself, which is that of all of those people, he was the only one to have seen it with his older brother in color on the big screen when he was a kid, in full Technicolor glory. You have to remember, most of the people were familiar with these films at the time. They were watching films about 5-10 years removed. And all these films were in a package of Sabu films that were on one of the 3 channels on television, all in black and white. And they would all watch these films on loop in repeat. And Sabu was as much a part of their childhoods as Mickey Mouse or whatever. And this is how Scorsese, De Palma, Spielberg, Lucas all came to this movie, only really seeing the Technicolor version much later in the 60s when they got to Hollywood, or, at retro screenings. Coppola was one of the few that got to experience it kind of on the big screen in Technicolor. And I think that might in no small part account for his enthusiasm for the film and how much of an impact it was on him.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't blame him. Dan, thank you so much. For you guys in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear more of our conversation. And without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy from 1940, The Thief of Baghdad.
Enjoy.
What a truly magnificent film. This is still one of my favorite movies of all time.
It truly is one of the great ones. And as I was, one of the great adventure special effects pictures of all time. And, as I think, you've said before, I've heard you say, there are no old movies if you haven't seen it. And if anyone else
Yeah.
hasn't seen it, hopefully that felt, fresh to them in that way. Because I think when special effects like this are, done to be sort of cast a spell in the way this was done, they do really become timeless, because it doesn't become about how they've aged, because there's something beneath that, which is a sense of adventure and, a sense of mystery, a sense of, illusion, that makes it fun.
Yeah. Well, one thing we spoke about earlier is that the film, it's called The Thief of Baghdad. But at the same time, it's not really a remake. It's not really a straight adaptation of the Fairbanks film. Obviously, there are scenes that are restaged that pay homage, like the scene where Abu is stealing the glowing eye from the all-seeing eye from the idol. That's taken from the
Right.
Fairbanks film. The magic carpet, the idea of the flying horse, even though that's presented in a very different context here. But fundamentally, it's a very different story because in the original, Douglas Fairbanks, he's the hero. He is Ahmad, the thief, who's moonlighting as the prince, who's out there to get the
Right.
girl.
He's all of them. Yeah.
He's everyone. He's the lead. Where this film is kind of fascinating because it splits that into 2 separate characters. So on one hand, you do have Sabu as Abu, the title character, the thief of Baghdad, but then
Yeah.
the co-lead of it is John Justin, who's the Caliph Ahmad, who's displaced, and the movie's just about as much about him as it is about Sabu's character.
That's completely correct. And
Yeah.
I think though one of the things that I really like about that, and it's funny, one could infer certain things from the separation about perhaps the time, and not to impose a racial dimension on it where one may not be. But would that be a reason for it? But I think it's my instinct, based on what I've read, that Alexander Korda, I think, was for a number of reasons very wise to separate the characters. And I think one of the big reasons was, I think, partly what excited him about the material was his discovery of this actor Sabu, who quite literally he discovered only 2 years earlier at the age, I think, of 14. In India, filming a film called The Elephant Boy, of which Sabu was an elephant boy. He literally was someone dealing with the elephants, and could tell he had this charismatic, childlike charm and exuberance, and sort of anyone watching him, he kind of turned them into a child watching it. And I think why he was wise to do that is that, when you separate out those 2 characters, I think what Sabu's strength is as a performer is exactly that. He's able to turn the audience make them a child like he is, where they have that enthusiasm, they believe in that sincerity. And the sort of romantic lead is something a little different than that. And I don't know if you recall, but when I was a kid, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because,
Yeah.
but when we were young, I would always get to the romantic parts of the movie and be like, ooh, gross, you know what I mean? Or something like that. And I think even Coppola, when he was talking about his enthusiasm, always said that he can appreciate it now as an adult. But when he was younger, he always sort of thought the John Justin scenes were kind of boring and couldn't wait for them to be over. He just wanted to get back to Sabu and to be the adventurous and the fun one. And Sabu is presented as someone who's kind of deriding that a little bit. He's sort of a rapscallion, and it's more about his friendship with him, and you find him helping out his friend, and every child, I think, can identify with that. and he sort of mocks him for his romantic devotion. You know what I mean? So it adds that sort of playful quality to the film that, it amplifies it in a way that takes it a little bit out of the realm of romance, but there's just enough romance for those who want it to. And indeed, that's kind of what's great about the film, is that um, almost all of the characters, with the exception of Conrad Veidt, um, they are all like children. They're all child. They all have a sort of childlike enthusiasm that they approach everything with. You know what I mean? And Sabu being really the anchor, I think, of that. You know.
Well, absolutely. Let's talk about how incredible Conrad Veidt is as the villain. I mean, you can pronounce it Jafar, Jafar. There's a couple of different
Yeah.
ways of pronouncing it, but I
It's
kind
true. Well,
yeah,
now, as you said, we think of Jafar, and this film obviously is a very clear analog for the Disney Aladdin, which was
yeah,
such an impact on our childhood, probably in the way that it was on Coppola's this film.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
So it's understandable we would go that way. I'm not exactly sure of the spelling. I know in the film there's a great line where he comes in where he says, she says, "Who is it?" And he says, "It's Jafar. It's always
It's always Jafar. Yeah.
Jafar." And I thought I didn't hear an R there, so I'm sort of taking it from that.
I think it's the British pronunciation. Yeah.
That could very well be. Well, yeah, and Conrad Veidt is an actor who I'm very happy to talk about, because he's someone who does not, by today's standards, I think, get enough attention. And
Yeah.
this is truly, I think, one of the, I've always made this case. I make it now. It's I always identified more with the villains when I was a kid than the superheroes, and I think
Yeah.
why that is because, not because I had any particularly villainous intentions. I hope anyway, but the linchpin of any great adventure is an interesting villain. If you think about any of the great action movies, adventure films, they would be nothing if you didn't have a compelling person on the other side there keeping it interesting. And this is such a fascinating three-dimensional portrayal by Conrad Veidt of this character. In that, and I think you could argue, we brought up a little bit how this had many directors. And I think one of the big glues that holds it together is Alexander Korda. The other big glue, I think, is Conrad Veidt's performance, because he gives you such an arc and a three-dimensional character that is so compelling here and uniquely vulnerable for a villain. He inspires a great deal of sympathy, I think, more common in that he's not a two-dimensional villain, because you almost feel for him in that his love for the princess feels sincere. And while he's willing to go to any lengths to get it, he's very vulnerable in his devotion and in his pain in not getting it from her.
Yeah.
I mean, he literally has to go against his own wishes and plans to sometimes just help her get a little bit of the way to loving him.
Yeah. I mean,
It makes him sympathetic.
Oh, absolutely. Like, it could have been so simple just to have him be the mustache twirling heavy. He's out to get the throne. He's purely greedy, which that is one aspect of the character. But I think that romantic subplot, and I think Conrad Veidt's vulnerability brings a certain humanity to that part that I don't think it would have necessarily had it been someone like Bela Lugosi, who I love, or maybe some other villain actor from that era.
I would agree, and that's an interesting point to bring up, because it's worth mentioning as well. Because again, he had a very untimely death at the age of 50, and this was one of his last roles. I think only what remained is maybe the role, arguably, he's most remembered for, which was Major Strasser in Casablanca, was just after this film.
Yeah.
I think he did Above Suspicion with Hitchcock, and then that was when he suffered his heart attack at the age of 50. But at that time, he was truly a star in Germany and internationally in a way that is forgotten today. Having done some of the big German films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Hands of Orlok, The Man Who Laughs. All of these films, I mean, he was as big a star there as, Peter Lorre was, or Emil Jannings was. And only recently, with the advent of the, World War II coming and the Nazis, him having taken the leap over into English-speaking cinema, of which I make the case that, while it may not be the role he's most remembered for, it might be his best role of the English-speaking films that he had. And certainly one of the great villain portrayals in screen history. So, I'm glad the audience got to experience that. And again, you see why he was this star. He has that star quality, and why he was in Caligari and all of those films, because he is magnetic in his. There's an almost he would have been a great Anton Mesmer if they ever did a film about him, because he has that mesmeric quality in his attention. And indeed, he had turned down the role of Dracula before Bela Lugosi. He was one of the first people considered, which would have been interesting to think what that world might have looked like. I'm happy Bela got it, but I don't think we would have been too bad off had Conrad Veidt done it.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Film history certainly would have looked very different than it does now.
It most certainly would have. Absolutely. Yeah.
And we can't have a great Arabian Nights movie without a memorable genie. How great is Rex Ingram in this film?
Oh, he's fantastic. He's great. And he went on shortly after this. He's probably a little more known for films like A Cabin in the Sky. And he became, but had a great long career all the way. I think some of his last credits, I think he was actually in The Cosby Show, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Well, all the way leading up there, he was always a fixture and one of the great, black character actors from the time and leads of the time. His portrayal of the genie, and it's an interesting way into this, but one of the things I think is wonderful about this film is it's truly a fairy tale for children and adults, and it's a fairy tale in the true sense that Hans Christian Andersen and all the fairy tales used to be, the Grimm's brothers fairy tales used to be, which was a bit warts and all. There's an element of terror there. There's an element of fear there. There are very adult moments in this film, and it's certainly childlike, but I don't know if it's childish, because you have even a character like the Sultan, played by Miles Malleson, quite brilliantly, one of the great British character actors who, if you're a Hammer fan, appeared many times later
Yes.
in films like Brides of Dracula, The Hound of the Baskervilles, even in Dead of Night, which I don't think was Hammer, but it is one of the great horror
Oh yeah, of
films.
course. Yeah.
Um, and also in this, interestingly enough, he supposedly wrote most of the dialogue for the film as well. So we have a lot of that. And in keeping with that, Rex Ingram and Sabu certainly have some of the best high fantasy exchanges there in that. But, the genie creates a great level of terror. I think with that initial reaction, there's the fear at any moment. He could just turn and put the axe on Sabu or step on him or whatever. Indeed, he threatens it in that initial interaction, and he does a great job of balancing the terror and the comedy, and really nailing that dialogue. One of my favorite lines of the film is when he leaves him and he's like, you humans are funny. If you think with your stomach, you forget your brain. If you think with your brain, you forget your heart. And if you think with your heart, well, ha ha, and that laugh he has, you forget everything. And what better fantasy dialogue could you imagine than that? And so, yeah, he's fantastic. One of the best roles he ever did in this film, for sure. Absolutely. One of the great genies of all the genies we see.
One thing I think is fascinating about this film that a lot of the other adaptations of the Arabian Nights really don't do is this does have the framing device of the storyteller going back. And then it's almost episodic because it kind of jumps from adventure to adventure. And it's all one coherent story. But I think in that sense, it does preserve the flavor of the Thousand and One Nights in a way that a lot of the other films don't.
Absolutely, it's a bit of it feels a little bit like the sort of Russian doll device, which is a little
Yes.
bit what is the original 1001 Nights and the appeal of it. And I think you're absolutely right in that respect. And it's interesting as well to point out with this film. We talk about the subsequent versions of this and the popular versions of 1001 Nights Tales. This, I think, and even though the Douglas Fairbanks film predates it, what is also unique about this film in a socio sort of historical context is you're seeing the creation between, Vincent Corda and William Cameron Menzies. The aesthetic of this film is wildly impactful on everything that came after it that ever dealt with the Middle East or stories of this nature, and even all the way to the Disney Aladdin film. More so than the Douglas Fairbanks version, the way they do the turbans, the costumes, the design of the sets and everything, it had such an impact on everything that took place in this sort of Middle Eastern milieu that was a fantasy after it. All of it comes right back to here. I mean, everything was derivative of that. So, it's very impactful in that way because, and maybe not for the best, you know what I mean? I don't, I mean, in some ways, film is always meant to be fantasy and escapism. What is great about this is it is sort of another world. It's a fantasy world. It is
Yeah.
historical, but it's not meant to be historical. It's meant to be a sort of fantastical universe unto itself, of which the history is just a mere leaping off point, you know?
Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. Do you have anything else, any projects coming up that you'd like us to know about?
Well, I would like to say that I do have a commentary with the one, the only David Del Val, who your audience may be familiar with. I know he's done some of these videos. We have a commentary coming up that we've done together on For Whom the Bell Tolls, the Gary Cooper, Ingrid Bergman adaptation of the Ernest Hemingway novel that will be out by Kino Lorber in the near future. I think it will be announced very soon. Also done with production design by William Cameron Menzies as well. And it'll be it's a very, I hope, insightful and interesting look into that. So I hope you check out the film and the commentary as well. Yeah, I think that's probably the thing that's most current down the pike that your audience might have access to.
Yeah, well, I know is I'm a big fan of Kino Lorber. I love the restorations. I love what they're doing. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. And you guys in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. I'm here with Dan Marino. I hope you guys have a wonderful night.
I hope you guys do as well, and thank you very much, Ryan, for having me. And I hope everyone I hope everyone has not too sad of a foray back into regular reality as they leave the theater after experiencing the film they just did.